In the autumn of 2024, a quiet economic battle reached its boiling point. The European Union made a decisive move that would send shockwaves through the global automotive industry, officially approving sweeping tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. What seemed like a straightforward trade policy quickly escalated into something far more significant, a full-scale economic confrontation that now threatens to redefine the relationship between two of the world's largest trading partners. The implications became crystal clear within weeks. Beijing didn't just respond with diplomatic protests or empty threats. Instead, China's industrial giants began pulling billions of euros worth of investments from European soil, abandoning factory projects that European governments had spent years courting. The message was unmistakable. If Europe wants to play hardball, China is ready to walk away from the table entirely. This isn't just another trade dispute buried in policy documents and press releases. This is a pivotal moment that could reshape the global electric vehicle landscape for decades to come. And the stakes? They're astronomical, not just for automakers and battery manufacturers, but for millions of workers, entire regional economies, and the future of green transportation worldwide. Today, we're diving deep into this unfolding economic drama. We'll explore how China's electric vehicle revolution caught Europe off guard, why the EU felt compelled to erect trade barriers, and most importantly, what China's strategic countermeasures mean for Europe's industrial future. Because what's happening right now isn't just about cars or batteries, it's about economic sovereignty, technological leadership, and the new rules of 21st century global trade. To understand how we arrived at this critical juncture, we need to rewind and examine the stunning rise of Chinese electric vehicles in the European market. The transformation has been nothing short of extraordinary. Just a few years ago, Chinese car brands were barely a footnote in European automotive discussions. European consumers were loyal to their homegrown manufacturers: Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Renault, Fiat. These weren't just car brands, they were cultural icons representing decades of engineering excellence and national pride. But then something remarkable happened. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, backed by massive government support and rapid technological advancement, began flooding into the European market with products that were not only competitive, but often superior in key areas: price, range, technology features, and charging capabilities. The numbers tell a story that European policymakers found increasingly alarming. Recent market analysis reveals that 8 of the 10 best-selling electric vehicle brands across Europe are now Chinese-owned or Chinese-manufactured. Let that sink in for a moment. 8 out of 10. Even Tesla, the American electric vehicle pioneer that once dominated European sales charts, has been pushed down to 4th place, trailing significantly behind Chinese competitors. The penetration goes even deeper. Industry data from 2023 showed that approximately 19.5% of all electric vehicles sold across Europe were manufactured in China. But analysts aren't predicting this trend will plateau, quite the opposite. Current projections suggest that by the end of 2024, Chinese-made electric vehicles will account for roughly 25% of the European market, a full quarter of all EV sales. This rapid market capture represents one of the most dramatic shifts in automotive history. European car makers, who spent over a century building their reputations and dominance, suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered in the very sector they believed would define the future of transportation. For European automotive executives and government officials, this wasn't just a competitive challenge, it was an existential crisis. The European auto industry employs millions of people directly and supports countless more through its vast supply chain. Cities and entire regions have built their economies around automotive manufacturing. The prospect of watching this industrial base erode under pressure from Chinese competition was simply unacceptable to European leadership. Faced with this unprecedented competitive threat, the European Union launched what would become a comprehensive and controversial response. In mid-2023, the EU formally initiated an anti-subsidy investigation targeting Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers. The objective was straightforward: determine whether Chinese companies were receiving unfair government subsidies that gave them an artificial advantage in the European market. European officials argued that the playing field wasn't level. They claimed Chinese manufacturers benefited from extensive state support, subsidized loans, favorable land deals, research grants, tax breaks, and direct financial injections, advantages that European car makers couldn't match under EU competition rules. From Brussels' perspective, this wasn't free trade, it was state-sponsored market manipulation. The investigation moved with unusual speed by EU standards. By July 2024, the European Commission released its findings and proposed tariff structure. The penalties were substantial and targeted specific manufacturers based on their alleged subsidy levels. BYD, one of China's largest and most successful electric vehicle manufacturers, faced a 17% additional tariff on top of existing import duties. Geely, another major player with international ambitions, received an 18.8% tariff. But the harshest penalty was reserved for SAIC Motor Corporation, China's largest automaker, which was slapped with a massive 35.3% tariff. Other Chinese manufacturers operating through partnership arrangements faced a 20.7% tariff. These weren't minor adjustments. They were significant barriers designed to make Chinese electric vehicles substantially more expensive for European consumers, effectively erasing much of the price advantage that had made them so attractive in the first place. European officials framed these measures as necessary protection for domestic industry and jobs. They spoke of preserving European automotive heritage, maintaining industrial capacity, and ensuring fair competition. The rhetoric emphasized defending European interests against what they portrayed as unfair trade practices. But here's where the story takes a fascinating and somewhat contradictory turn. Even as the EU was imposing these punitive tariffs, European governments were simultaneously rolling out the red carpet for Chinese automotive investment. Throughout 2024, senior officials from Spain, Italy, Germany, and France engaged in high-level discussions with Chinese electric vehicle and battery manufacturers, actively encouraging them to establish production facilities on European soil. Business delegations traveled to China, investment conferences were organized, and attractive incentive packages were quietly assembled. This apparent contradiction reveals a more complex European strategy. By making it expensive to import Chinese electric vehicles while simultaneously welcoming Chinese factories, European policymakers believed they could achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. First, local manufacturing would create jobs and economic activity in Europe. Factory construction, supply chain development, and ongoing operations would pump money into European economies and provide employment for European workers. Second, and perhaps more importantly, having Chinese manufacturers operate within Europe would give European competitors closer access to Chinese technology and manufacturing processes. Industry analysts suggest that European officials hoped this proximity would enable technology transfer, whether through formal partnerships, employee movement between companies, or simply by observing and learning from Chinese operational methods. Third, once Chinese companies had significant capital invested in European factories, they would have a stake in maintaining good relations with European governments and would be less likely to pursue aggressive competitive strategies that might trigger further regulatory responses. It was, in essence, an attempt to have it both ways, protecting the European market through tariffs while simultaneously capturing the benefits of Chinese investment, technology, and know-how. Some observers have characterized this approach as an attempt to force Chinese companies into a specific pattern, make importing so expensive that building local factories becomes the only viable option for accessing the lucrative European market. However, this strategy rested on a critical assumption that Chinese companies would feel compelled to accept these terms because the European market was simply too valuable to abandon. That assumption, as we'll see, proved to be a significant miscalculation. As the tariff proposals moved through the EU's decision-making process, Chinese officials sought to negotiate a different outcome. Beijing initiated multiple rounds of discussions with European counterparts, hoping to find a compromise that would avoid the most severe trade restrictions. Between July and October 2024, Chinese and European negotiators met 9 separate times. These weren't brief courtesy calls, they were substantive discussions involving trade officials, industry representatives, and diplomatic channels. China proposed various alternative arrangements, including commitments to price floors, voluntary export restraints, and enhanced cooperation on electric vehicle standards. But as autumn progressed, it became increasingly clear that the two sides remained far apart. European negotiators insisted that significant tariffs were necessary and non-negotiable. Chinese officials argued that such measures violated World Trade Organization principles and would damage what had been a mutually beneficial trading relationship. In October 2024, the moment of truth arrived. The European Union held a formal vote among member states on whether to proceed with the tariff package. The outcome reflected deep divisions within Europe itself. 10 countries voted in favor of imposing the tariffs, 5 countries opposed them outright, and 12 countries abstained from taking a position. Despite the lack of overwhelming consensus, the measure passed. The tariffs would be implemented, with rates reaching as high as 35.3% for some Chinese manufacturers, layered on top of the existing 10% standard automotive import duty. For China, this vote represented a clear message. Negotiations had failed, and Europe had chosen confrontation over cooperation. Beijing's response would be swift and strategic. Within weeks of the EU's tariff decision, Chinese companies began announcing dramatic changes to their European investment plans. The first major casualty was a project that Germany, Europe's industrial powerhouse, had been counting on. Honeycomb Energy, China's 7th largest battery manufacturer and a critical supplier to the electric vehicle industry, made a stunning announcement. They were suspending operations at 2 European subsidiaries and halting construction on 2 massive battery factories in Germany. The company released a carefully worded statement explaining their decision. They cited market conditions in Europe that failed to meet expectations and noted that development in the European electric vehicle sector has diverged from the projections made by all stakeholders. While diplomatic in tone, the message was clear. The business environment in Europe had become untenable. The scale of what Germany was losing became apparent when the project details were examined. The first facility was planned for Saarland, a state in western Germany with a strong industrial heritage. This factory was designed to manufacture battery modules and complete battery pack assembly systems. Announced with great fanfare back in November 2020, the project carried a price tag of €2 billion and was engineered for an annual production capacity of 24 gigawatt-hours, enough to power hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles each year. Construction was supposed to be completed by mid-2024. The second project was even more ambitious. Located in the Lauchhammer area of Brandenburg in eastern Germany, this facility was conceived as Honeycomb Energy's first overseas battery cell manufacturing plant. Announced in September 2022, it promised an investment exceeding €1.87 billion, with planned annual capacity of 16 gigawatt-hours. Production was scheduled to begin in 2025. Combined, these 2 projects represented €3.87 billion in foreign direct investment and would have created thousands of jobs directly, plus many more in supporting industries. For regions that had struggled economically since German reunification, these factories represented hope for industrial renewal. Honeycomb Energy announced that the suspension would officially take effect on January 31, 2025. But provided no timeline for when or if construction might resume. The projects that German officials had spent years courting were essentially dead, at least for the foreseeable future. The timing of this decision carried particular significance. Europe's domestic battery manufacturing sector is struggling. Northvolt, a European battery manufacturer that was supposed to lead the continent's charge toward battery independence, recently announced layoffs affecting 1,600 employees, roughly 20% of its workforce. This came after production delays, quality issues, and financial difficulties that raised questions about Europe's ability to build a competitive battery industry. Germany's loss wasn't just about the money or even the jobs, though both were substantial. It was about strategic positioning. Battery technology is the heart of the electric vehicle revolution. Without a robust domestic battery supply chain, Europe would remain dependent on foreign suppliers, ironically primarily Chinese and Korean companies. The suspension of these projects pushed that goal of battery independence further out of reach. But Germany wasn't the only European country to feel China's economic pushback. Italy, a nation with its own proud automotive heritage, found itself in an even more awkward position. Italy's automotive sector has been under pressure for years. Stellantis, the multinational corporation formed from the merger of Fiat Chrysler and PSA Group, dominates the Italian market, but has been gradually shifting production to lower-cost countries. Earlier in 2024, Stellantis announced plans to move some Italian production lines to Morocco, where labor and operational costs are significantly lower. This decision sent shockwaves through Italian industrial regions that depend heavily on automotive manufacturing. Desperate to fill the gap and maintain its automotive manufacturing base, Italy began actively courting Chinese investment. In March 2024, Italian officials publicly announced they were in negotiations with 3 Chinese automotive companies, hoping to convince them to establish manufacturing operations in Italy. To sweeten the deal, Italian authorities invited executives from these companies to visit potential factory sites and experience what Italy could offer as a manufacturing base. Despite Italy's efforts, all 3 companies ultimately declined. After comprehensive assessments of costs, logistics, market access, and regulatory environment, none found the Italian proposition compelling enough to commit. Undeterred, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni personally traveled to China in July 2024. The visit was explicitly designed to attract Chinese automotive investment, and Italian media portrayed it as a crucial economic mission. Following Meloni's visit, negotiations between China's Dongfeng Motor Corporation and the Italian government advanced significantly. Reports suggested that a deal was close, with Italian officials treating this as a major diplomatic and economic achievement. Then came October's EU tariff vote. Despite the ongoing negotiations with Chinese companies, despite Meloni's recent visit to Beijing, and despite Italy's desperate need for automotive investment, the Italian government voted in favor of imposing high tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The decision stunned Chinese officials and business leaders. From Beijing's perspective, Italy was trying to have it both ways, supporting punitive tariffs while simultaneously expecting Chinese companies to invest billions in Italian factories. The response was predictable and swift. According to sources close to the negotiations, Chinese companies involved in discussions about Italian factories decided to suspend their investment plans. The projects that Prime Minister Meloni had touted as proof of her successful China policy were suddenly off the table. For Italy, the consequences extend beyond losing immediate investment. Italy's electric vehicle market is underdeveloped compared to other major European economies. Despite high car ownership rates, electric vehicles account for only 4 to 6% of total vehicle sales in Italy. The country badly needs both infrastructure development and manufacturing capacity to participate meaningfully in the electric vehicle transition. Industry observers noted that Italy hadn't just been seeking factory investment, they had also requested technology transfer arrangements as part of any deal. Italian officials hoped that Chinese partners would share electric vehicle and battery technology, helping Italy build indigenous capabilities in these critical sectors. With Chinese companies now backing away, Italy faces the prospect of falling further behind in the electric vehicle revolution, while simultaneously dealing with the erosion of its traditional automotive manufacturing base. The suspension of these major investment projects represents more than just bilateral economic friction. It signals a fundamental shift in how China approaches economic relations with countries that impose trade restrictions. For decades, Chinese companies often accepted less than ideal terms to gain access to developed markets. The strategy was to establish presence, build relationships, accept some technology sharing, and gradually expand influence. Patient, long-term thinking characterized Chinese business strategy in Europe and North America. But the response to EU tariffs suggests this approach may be evolving. Rather than accepting punitive trade measures while still pursuing European investment, Chinese companies are increasingly willing to redirect capital to more welcoming markets. Some Chinese automotive companies have already canceled major promotional events in Europe. Changan Automobile, one of China's largest car makers, canceled its European product launch scheduled for Milan, stating that future plans for the European market would depend entirely on how tariff policies develop. The implication was clear. If Europe doesn't want Chinese cars, Chinese companies won't waste resources trying to convince them otherwise. This represents a significant psychological shift. Europe is accustomed to being a must-have market for global companies. Its wealthy consumers, established infrastructure, and regulatory prestige have traditionally made it irresistible for companies with global ambitions. The idea that Chinese firms might simply walk away from Europe was not part of the expected scenario. Chinese officials and business leaders increasingly point to alternative markets that offer better opportunities with less political friction. Southeast Asia represents a massive growth opportunity. With young populations, rising incomes, and governments generally welcoming Chinese investment. The Middle East, flush with oil wealth and investing heavily in economic diversification, is actively courting Chinese automotive and technology companies. Latin America, Africa, and Central Asia all represent markets where Chinese electric vehicles face less political opposition and where infrastructure development creates opportunities for comprehensive partnerships. From a Chinese perspective, the question becomes, why fight uphill battles in Europe when there are markets elsewhere that actually want what Chinese companies are offering? For European policymakers, the Chinese response creates an uncomfortable dilemma. The tariffs were supposed to protect European industry and create breathing room for domestic manufacturers to catch up. But if Chinese companies respond by abandoning investment plans and reducing their presence in Europe, the outcome might actually harm European interests. Without Chinese investment in battery factories, Europe becomes more dependent on imported batteries, likely from the same Chinese companies they're trying to disadvantage. The European battery industry has proven unable to scale fast enough to meet demand, as demonstrated by Northvolt's struggles, and the fact that European automakers still rely heavily on Asian battery suppliers. If Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers decide to largely abandon the European market, European consumers lose access to affordable, high-quality electric vehicles. This could slow Europe's transition to electric mobility, making it harder to meet climate goals and potentially leaving European consumers stuck with more expensive, less competitive vehicles from domestic manufacturers who face reduced competitive pressure to innovate. Perhaps most concerning from a European strategic perspective, if Chinese companies find success in other global markets while reducing their European presence, Europe risks becoming less relevant in shaping the future of global automotive technology and standards. China, already the world's largest automotive market, would potentially dominate not just its domestic market, but also most of the developing world, leaving Europe as a smaller, more isolated market. Some European officials and business leaders are beginning to question whether the tariff strategy was wise. 5 EU member states voted against the tariffs, and 12 abstained, suggesting significant skepticism existed from the start. Countries like Hungary and Germany, which have significant economic ties to China, expressed concern that protectionist measures would ultimately backfire. German automotive executives in particular have been vocal in their opposition to the tariffs. Companies like BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen have substantial manufacturing operations in China and export vehicles from China to global markets. They fear Chinese retaliation could harm their interests and that reducing Chinese competition might actually slow innovation in the European market. As of late 2024, the situation remains fluid and potentially volatile. The tariffs are set to take effect, Chinese investments are being suspended, and both sides are watching carefully to see who blinks first. Several scenarios could unfold. In one possibility, the economic pain from lost investment and reduced market competition might push some EU member states to reconsider their position, potentially leading to renewed negotiations and a compromise agreement. However, reversing course would represent a significant political defeat for European leaders who champion the tariffs.